Hey, welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Brian Christopherson here on Tuesday morning. The Huskers picked up a transfer portal addition Tuesday morning. Jaylen George joins the East Tennessee State Buccaneers. Jaylen George, a defensive lineman, the third known commitment out of the transfer portal at this point, joining Kevin Gallick and Williams Winery. PC, do you have thoughts on Jaylen George? It's okay if you don't have like full blown out thoughts on Jaylen George.
I knew that coming into his visit that he was excited to possibly pull the trigger on Nebraska. So, I mean, he had talked to Brunts about this, and so it doesn't surprise me that he's on board. Anytime you can add, we'll see where he fits. They're going to have to go compete, and we'll see who's like the top of the ladder and who's down a couple of rungs. But they need bodies on the defensive line, and he was productive last year. He had 6 tackles for loss at East Tennessee State. And I think Nebraska, saw something in the film. They're like, let's get him on an official visit. They're not having everybody in the Lincoln. So obviously they saw something to work with. And he'll be a nice piece for Terry Braden, who's expected to be the D-line coach. And that should be officially named soon too.
Yeah, that'll certainly be an interesting piece of it. Jaylen George, productive in his 2 seasons of East Tennessee State, got there by way of Suwanee, Georgia, which I think is a suburb of Atlanta. I should probably look that up before making such proclamations. Has 3 sacks in his career, 24 solo tackles, a handful of tackles for a loss, a couple forced fumbles and fumble recoveries. Brian, to me, as much as anything, this is about just adding some depth back into your defensive line room, and a guy who will have 2 seasons to play, and just kind of seeing what you're able to get out of him. I don't know that he is a day one starter by any means, but perhaps a nice rotational piece for the Huskers.
Yeah, you just have to see once they get going and put in pads. But I mean, there's been some guys in the portal who were sort of in that category right now in their careers, like a Vincent Jackson who's left. And so all these guys matter, whether he ends up being a frontline guy for you or he's 6, 7, or 8 in the rotation. I'm not here to say that right now in December, not knowing that much about him and who else is going to be on board here yet. But certainly, I think they felt like you're going after guys you think are going to be in your rotation next year if you're going into the portal. And so that's going to be the expectation from anybody they pluck out here. And there is a need just as much if he's the 5th or 6th guy as if he's the 2nd or 3rd guy.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I also just, I said this on that last podcast where I sort of mocked when people are upset when a player doesn't come from a name brand school. I think it's important this guy has played for 2 seasons. He's got reps. It's not like he's someone who just sat around and can only show you practice squad film. This is a guy that's played in games and has been out there on the field. And yeah, it was at a level below, but he'll have the opportunity to kind of go through spring. And I just don't see how it hurts. I mean, you got to backfill and you want to have as competitive of a roster as you can. And I think Jaylen George is a step towards that. And he joins, as I said, Williams Winery, and then Kevin Gallick as the known portal guys. As we kind of go through this portal experience, Brian, is there a player or two that really stands out to you as I'm really intrigued by that guy? It'd be a big deal if Nebraska got him, or I think this is a really important position of need. Anything like that for you so far of some of the targets and names that we've been hearing about?
Well, I mean, Eric Rivers from Florida International just completed his visit. I know he's at Georgia Tech as we're doing this podcast and has his options, but I mean, he just lit up the 24 season. When you look at his numbers, was like over 1,100 yards, 62 catches. And he's kind of got an interesting story where he started as a DB, didn't take off right away at Memphis, went to FIU. And it kind of goes with what you were saying talked, about Jaylen George. Like there's an example of a player who has not been in the power conference level, but he's got a lot of production and a lot of snaps under him. And I think that counts for a lot. And so you watch him closely. I think at receiver, the kid out of Cal, Isaiah Hunter, is an interesting name just because he would have 3 or 4 years still.
It's an interesting name in addition to being an interesting name.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've seen that one before. How did you pronounce that?
I said Isaiah. I don't know if I'm right.
Isaiah Hunter. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I had no idea. The remarkable thing is he did that as a freshman.
Yes. I think he would be one of the better gets if you secured him at receiver. And so you've got options there. It's obvious that Jonah Pace has been through here. He's out of Central Michigan. Cameron Olds is really kind of an interesting player out of Kent State. You're kind of trying to replace what you lost in like a Jamari Butler, and maybe there's some of that there. And then I think there's going to be a big O-line splash or two still, whether it's a tackle or you try to find someone who's like a center. The kid from Michigan was in, and he didn't have just a ton of experience as far as actual snaps, but he started some games for them this past year, and you could rework your O-line a little bit. So I think O-line's been the one that people have sometimes talked over as far as portal possibilities, but it could be key to land that big signature piece if it's a tackle or someone where you can kind of work around, especially to protect your franchise quarterback.
Yeah, I think the guy that you're sort of alluding to, Nebraska, is one of the 3 finalists for Isaiah World, a massive offensive lineman from Nevada. Originally, I don't know where he's from originally, but he is San Diego. He's originally from San Diego, and he is looking at Nebraska, Texas A&M, and Oregon. Brian, this is one, if Nebraska were to come out on top, that they would have they would have had to put some money into it because he is going to get a big NIL deal wherever he ends up, especially when you're talking about those 3 teams. Isaiah World would be a big offensive line addition. You mentioned Cameron Olds as well. That's a guy that, again, coming from Kent State, the numbers aren't amazing. Like, they're not going to blow anyone away, and yet he's pretty intriguing pass rusher. He's a guy that I think can help your football team. He's someone who's a little bit older and has experience, and I think that's what some of this is kind of about. It's just going and finding guys that you can plug in, and you're not going to have too big of a drop off in terms of maybe where you were at before. And so certainly will be interesting to keep an eye on all of it. We haven't had a ton of chance to dive into the news from last week in Williams Winery. Brian, do you have any immediate thoughts there in terms of what Nebraska added with a former 5-star defensive lineman who probably going to line up as I don't think he'll be a jack, but I think he'll be on Nebraska's defensive line.
My thought is that we're in an interesting time and place where someone who has completed 1 year of college football, sometimes there's like, oh, he didn't get that much done his first year at Missouri. And it's like, go look at the history of people who have come up as linemen, some of the greatest linemen we've seen in college football, including at Nebraska, like Ndamukong Suh, and look at how their first year or two went, how many reps they played, and all that stuff. So I don't know what his career holds, but I think it's awesome that you have someone who is the number 6 player in the last recruiting class. Actually, 1 spot ahead of Dylan Raiola, was number 7 in our final rankings. I mean, that's pretty amazing to just say out loud that you have the number 6 and number 7 guy, 2 of the top 7 in your program right now. And so they got to be as excited as heck just to work with that potential. And of course, potentials, I think this was the old line from Moneyball. It's one of the most dangerous words, promise and potential. Like, you got to then go live up to it, but you'd rather have it than not have it. And he certainly throughout his whole recruiting process was a player that people thought could be like, that all conference type of difference maker. So he's got to go get it now, but he's going to have a good infrastructure around him with people I think he really trusts. There's sort of that base that's being built up with some Kansas City, Missouri type guys. Jamar Mose obviously here is huge, and I think we're just starting to see the ripples there of how big that could be. So Nebraska's got a nice thing working with like what they might be able to get done in Kansas City, which has so long been a difficult area, and also how they can keep building in like Miami with Phil Simpson and off the successes of the guys who were here last year as freshmen. So I would just lean into that because there's some talent there that has been out of reach for Nebraska, and this might be we might be changing that narrative a little bit here in big part because Jamar Mosey's on this staff. It's definitely a help.
Not nearly as big of a name, but arguably maybe as important as any addition Nebraska will have out of portal season. Kevin Gallick from New Hampshire, come on down. You're the long snapper. Everyone wants to know your name today. They don't need to know your name tomorrow. It was a good conversation. I talked with Kevin, and he basically said, like, once Nebraska got involved, I was pretty locked on to that because he has one season to play. He wanted to see if he could play at the highest level. To him, the Big Ten is the highest level. And, he wants to see where it goes after that. But once Ed Foley made that phone call and was like, hey, do you want to get on a Zoom? Do you want to have a conversation? And then it just kind of spurred from there. Nebraska immediately jumped to the forefront. And look, it's no secret they had massive special teams issues, and it started with just even snapping a football. And so you're hoping just switching out that component with a veteran like Kevin Gallick goes a long way for Nebraska. And he's got one season, so it's certainly a temporary fix, but it hopefully is a large increase over the quality of what we saw from the long snapping this past year.
Yeah, and you can connect that to another expected visitor this week who he confirmed to me, and I'm pretty sure he confirmed to you, Andrew Marshall out of Idaho, who's a DB, but also pretty good return man, right? I mean, he had some juice back there. So yes, the finer points of special teams need to improve, and some decisions and certain things we've seen. But first things first, you've got to get like those just main boxes checked. So the fundamentals just have to be in play. Like snaps, you can't have any bad ones. I mean, very rarely. You got to have, I thought Buschini had a pretty solid year, but they could be getting a punter from Washington. I know as Jack McAllister's visiting, and so you think about Marshall as a return man option, and you've got to make that a threat again. Nebraska has too many resources as a program to be the type of place where you're just trying to simply break even as it's been with special teams for so long. It's got to be like you expect to win this phase of the game. The same way Iowa expects to win that phase of the game. And they did against Nebraska, and that's a big reason they won that game that they shouldn't have won. So that has to send everybody looking in the mirror, if they weren't already, about like, how you got to fix some specific areas.
Yeah, it'll be when Matt Rule is kind of required to give a postseason exit interview, if you will, and walk through what's going to change with special teams. I'm going to be fascinated on that, whether it's just Ed Foley, whether there's a whole operational shift. They can't go through another year like they had this year. I mean, I think that, it might come off harsh, but I thought it was an embarrassment for a program that I know puts a lot of emphasis on special teams. To play the way they did in that phase was not good. And so we've seen here in the portal just going and getting a long snapper, having a visiting punter, having visiting return man in Andrew Marshall, who, by the way, talking with Dan Jackson, who knows him very well. Dan Jackson, former Omaha Burke coach, former coach at South Dakota State, former coach at Northern Illinois and Vanderbilt, and was at Idaho with Andrew Marshall and Jason Eck before he just took the job at New Mexico. Dan feels very strongly on Andrew Marshall. He thinks the guy can play. Anyone who thinks that a kid coming from Idaho doesn't belong in Big Ten football, he would encourage you to put on the tape from the Oregon game. And, not just coming here to be a returner, would be coming here as a guy who's playing in your defensive backfield as well. And so, not that Nebraska is the only school chasing him, but I think they've got a pretty fair shot. And, Dan had nothing but good things to say. And obviously, he played for Dan Jackson, and Dan is a player's coach. But I just thought that was really interesting. He really strongly emphasized to put on that Oregon tape to see what an Andrew Marshall could bring, both, as a defensive back, but also as a returner.
We're hitting on a familiar theme here. You think about some guys when the portal wasn't quite as portal-y as it is now, maybe a few years back, but we've gotten excited in these parts. And I'm not going to name any names, but people can think of them, of guys.
Name them.
No. Guys who were had been at a big program for a couple years, and they'd had multiple seasons, let's just say, at a certain spot, and then they got here, and it wasn't quite the same. There's been a couple examples of that, and I am with you. I like these guys who have a couple years of film in games. I don't care if it's at a lower level, but they've really produced, and you're getting the cream of the crop that have produced there. And I don't know that Indiana can keep doing what they're doing. I don't expect them to, but there was a knock, and some people were a little snarky about even Signetti when he brought over his crew from James Madison. And it's like, okay, how are those guys going to adapt to this level? And they did all right. Some of their main guys, Curtis Rourke obviously came up a level and did all right. And I'm not saying you just find those and can duplicate what Indiana did in a single season, but it's a good example that there's a lot of players that have produced below the Power Four that are both experienced and hungry, have a chip on their shoulder in some cases that I think can be pretty useful.
Yeah, well, I look at a guy Nebraska's going to have in this weekend, and Adrian Maddox, and his career starts at Alabama State, and he's productive for 2 years there, and he gets the opportunity to move up, goes to UAB, has a nice strong season for UAB, and now he's in the portal again. And we can bemoan the fact that he's going to be at 3 schools across 4 years, but if he ends up at Nebraska, this is a guy who basically started at one of the lower level FCS programs and worked his way into a situation where he was good enough to go play for UAB, and then felt like he was good enough in his year at UAB to challenge himself to see if he can get an opportunity at another conference. It's hard to begrudge somebody like that. And then you also have to kind of assume those guys are achievers. Like, he's been successful at all of these stops. It would be, I think, a little bit flippant to think that someone like Adrian Maddox couldn't be successful if he ends up at Nebraska, that the jump from UAB to Nebraska, that he would have different teammates around him and his responsibilities would be different. But he could still be a successful, safety on the back end for you, or a rotational piece, or whatever it is. So I would much rather see Nebraska continue to, go after guys who have produced at wherever they're playing than it is just betting on getting the MJ Sherman where the talent was so stacked in front of them that, they weren't able to break through at Georgia, but they got the opportunity in Lincoln and then were able to do it. I mean, it just seems you're far more likely to end up having successful players when they've had the Samari Toure path than if you're just hoping that they're going to be a success because they're coming from a program that is known for producing talent. So yeah. I don't mind it. I mean, and again, not every player that you get out of the portal has to be a star for you. I think that's the other misconception. You're looking for contributors. You're looking to make your roster better. You're looking for role players that fit in areas where maybe you're a little weak right now. You're looking for guys to come in and challenge your players to make them better. It's not everyone that comes through or comes out of the portal has to be an immediate day one starter or has to be the best player on your team. And so I think sometimes we get into the conversation about, oh, well, is this guy going to be a starter? Well, maybe not, but can he give you some good reps? Can he give you great practice competition? Can he help make your team better? That has to count for something too.
Yeah, that's where, and that brings us back to Jaylen George, we don't know where he's going to be, but I mean, That's a position group where you just need to stack a lot of good first, and then you hope like you have multiple guys that are just great, and you get someone that develops into a Ty Robinson, and then you really take off. But you do need um, that's a room where 5 through 10 has to be solid. And if that's where a couple of these guys who get announced fit, that's still good. That's still very useful to this program. You're absolutely right.
Let's finish up with a conversation on the newest Nebraska assistant, Addison Williams, expected to be the defensive backs coach. Previously was the defensive coordinator at UCF. Kind of an interesting background. He's been a defensive coordinator at 3 different stops, 3 different levels. Was the DC at Furman briefly, was the DC at a small school before Furman. A guy that seems to have some real coaching acumen. Is not deep into his career, but he was able to be a Power 4 defensive coordinator for UCF. What are your thoughts when you size up the resume of Addison Williams, of what Nebraska is getting here with their next defensive backs coach as John Butler moves into the defensive coordinator role?
I like when you can take someone who's been a DC, and if they're going to that position, position group like a secondary role, just like the experience they have as an overseer of the whole operation on defense. Like, I just think that's so beneficial. And this is where you also have to trust or just hope that Matt Rule and John Butler really did their homework and they saw how he fits into like what they want to do, how his ideas connect really well with theirs. It's sort of like when you listen to Matt Rule at the last press conference, he was talking, he couldn't say his name yet, but the D-line coach is going to be Terry Braden, who's the assistant defensive line coach for the Chiefs. And Rule talked to, I can't think of his name right now. He's the D-line coach of the Chiefs, really respected.
Joe.
It's escaping me right now, but
it's on the tip of my tongue.
He's one of the better D-line coaches in football. And that's who Braden's been under. And Braden has learned the same system that Rule's crew has used, for forever. It's what Terrence Knighton knew, was coached by this guy. And so sometimes, there's this surface reaction to a name. It's like, who has heard of most position coaches? Not me. I didn't, I don't know who the assistant D-line coach is for like the Carolina Panthers or
you
New
know
York
who the
Giants.
Assistant D-line coach is for the Vikings? I don't.
No, exactly.
I don't even know that I could tell you the defensive line coach for the Vikings right now.
Yeah. But in the coaching world, there's a fraternity there, and there are certain guys who have the most valued opinions. Like he's like, okay, he's sort of a person who's done this well for decades. And if he tells you this guy over here is pretty good, you better pay attention to it. So I'm excited about the Terry Braden hire. I know that wasn't our topic. We were talking about Addison Williams, but I talked to DiCaprio Boodle too, who was in that Chiefs locker room, and people could say, well, what does he know? He's a cornerback, like and Braden was the D-line, but he said that Braden was one of those guys who just had a voice in that operation. Like, he was a guy who really worked with veteran, like he could be an all-pro guy, could be a rookie, and he was really well respected as a hands-on coach. So his role in title may not jump off the page to anybody, but I think they did their homework on that one really well, and they feel very confident about their D-line hire. And I say all these words to connect back to Addison Williams, and you just trust that they did the same research, and they feel like this fits with our mindset right now of what we want to be.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned having Phil Simpson getting into Miami. I mean, Addison Williams coaching at UCF. He's been in the South, for much of his stops. He was at Auburn. He's been around Gus Malzahn, so he understands the recruiting operation that's going on there. He understands recruiting at a high level. And so I like it. Brian, it feels like if I was to size up how Nebraska is going to go about doing their recruiting, I think they have moved away from some of their efforts into the Northeast. I think that they are going to recruit everybody that they like as hard as they possibly can in the states that surround Nebraska, whether that be into the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, Missouri, into Iowa and potentially into Illinois, but not a whole lot further than that. And then down into Oklahoma and Texas. And then they're really going to recruit Florida and parts of Georgia hard. Like, I just think like that's their recruiting area. I don't think they're going to spend a lot of time going out to California. I don't think they're going to spend a lot of time going to the Pacific Northwest. I think they kind of have dialed in as to what they want to attack, how they want to attack it. The bulk of the class is going to come from the Midwest, and then they're going to try to go get some skill guys and defensive backs and everything from the Southeast and Texas. I mean, I just think they kind of have a blueprint for how they want to recruit and build now a little bit. And so to go get a Phil Simpson and an Addison Williams, and you're going to try to turn those guys loose in Texas, you got your connections, in Florida, you have your connections in Texas. We'll see where Terry Braden, another guy with Florida connections, another guy with Miami connections. I just think that's how it sets up for what they want to do.
You have to strike, especially recruiting, when you've got something you can put right in front of kids' faces and say, like, okay, look at the last class out of Miami and those 5 guys. They're all in the program as we do this podcast right now. They seem like they're ready to go in 25. And 3 of them took off, and 2 of them are really eager to, like in Amari Sanders and Larry Barber. And all those guys, you've done this where you've talked to guys in Miami, like players down there. They know everybody. Like everybody knows of that kid. And so there's a connection there where you can say, look at what Willis McGahee's doing. Look at what Shavers is doing. And you've got to strike while the iron is hot. I always use this old example, but it's an easily accessible one that goes to recruiting. Nebraska had the greatest D lineman maybe to play college football in Ndamukong Suh. I don't feel like in that era right after they got enough out of what was happening with the current example they could have used in front of people. So you've got to take whatever it is, even if it's to a smaller level. In this case, we're talking about Miami kids, and you've got to bank on that. And I think they're going to, like you say. And you got to do the same thing now in KC. You've got a little momentum there with Dawson Merritt and the Mosey connection and all that. And why would you not lean into that? And they will. One last thing on Addison Williams. Besides, I mean, obviously he was trusted by Gus Malzahn, but he was he had the assistant to the head coach title at Auburn even in 2019 for Malzahn, who maybe it didn't go quite like they wanted to in UCF, but you have to say there was a time when Malzahn was sort of cooking in one of the names, like as a head coach. And obviously he saw a lot to like in Addison Williams to have him in such a primary spot on his staff.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super valuable thing. I like seeing a guy that's not a particularly old coach that's got 3 different defensive coordinator stops. It tells me that, he's going to be able to add value into that room, and this is what he's seeing. This is how things are kind of working. And then, I think that'll help too as he goes to recruit. I thought it was a name that I wasn't prepared to see pop up because, again, I don't study position coaches and defensive coordinators around college football, but I think it's a guy that they're probably going to have some success with. I'm very curious how Matt Rule talks about him and when John Butler talks about that process, what it was that stood out for him or what kind of the connection was. But it seems to me, Brian, that even, go back to that previous staff, when Matt Rule has kind of ventured away from people that he's worked with directly, they've ended up with some pretty intriguing guys. And I think that's probably what we're seeing here again in Terry Braden and potentially with Addison Williams. I mean, 2 guys that aren't from the traditional, they didn't play for Matt Rule. They didn't come from Temple. They didn't come from Baylor. They didn't come from the Matt Rule tree, if you will, the way that Phil Simpson maybe has. But I'm very intrigued when he talks about those guys, what it was that stood out for him in the process. Because I would imagine they had quite a few different people that were interested in that defensive backs job.
Yeah, no doubt. And we got an interesting scenario. We'll see who is all involved. I assume most of these guys would be in the coaching in the Pinstripe Bowl. We know it's going to be John Butler's defense. They haven't officially announced some of them, so that's where the part is where you wonder exactly how it all fits together as far as the upcoming game. But that's intriguing, like, for those who are like, yeah, the Pinstripe Bowl, I don't know if I can get fired up for it. It's pretty interesting game, really, because it is like sometimes in the past, we've tried to talk like this is a leap into next year, back when we talked about bowl games a decade ago. But we did talk about that, and it felt a little forced. But now more than ever, it actually does feel like it's the beginning of 2025, especially like it's the first product you're getting. And it's not, we should not overly judge on Butler off what they're doing in this makeshift time period in December with how they perform in this bowl game. But there is that part that's pretty fascinating to this game ahead, like how they go out and do after some of these roles have been named already.
Yeah. I know that you don't want to do this because it doesn't reward the people currently playing on the roster, but the way the portal is set up and everything, I so much want bowl games to be moved into, like, if your team qualifies for a bowl, you get to play in a specialty game in April, and it replaces your spring game. And so then I think you get so much more out of this, instead of like bowl season runs congruent with a bunch of guys going into the portal. So you have these kind of weird games as it is anyways. Not that I'm not interested for the December 28th game, but how much more exciting would it be if, like, these teams were playing on April 14th? Probably wouldn't be in Yankee Stadium. There might be some logistical issues with that. But if they were playing like a spring game sort of against each other in a bowl game setting with Dylan Raiola available and whoever you get out of the portal, like, that's where I think one change that needs to come to college football is moving towards that. If you don't qualify for a bowl game, you still get to have your regular spring game. This is just in addition to it.
That's pretty interesting. It's not a bad idea. There's some things you'd have to get the iron out. There's probably some wrinkles you got to think about, but I like the concept because it's already just confusing as heck with the portal and everything else that's going on right now. So to allow everybody to kind of, settle your rosters. You're going to be able to use your what you did this last season, and that you're right. It would take out the guys who were seniors, although you could have like a special thing if like it didn't work out for them, and if it wasn't going to wear the NFL, they could play one more game, I guess. I don't know, but we'll have to figure that out to submit our paper on how this should be the new way.
The senior thing only really matters at Nebraska, where they hadn't played in a bowl for 8 years. So
you're right.
Like, not once you're kind of beyond that point, it's not as big of an issue. But for Nebraska, it's going to be a big deal for Ty Robinson to play in that game, and some of those guys who Bryce Benhart, who've stuck around for as long as they did to help put Nebraska in a position to leave, qualifying for a bowl. So we're gonna have some more opportunity to dive into some bowl talk. We're gonna have to figure out how are we gonna try to do some podcasts while you and Brunts are in New York. Are you gonna have to file into some kind of crowded coffee shop and we'll have to do a weird podcast that way, or we'll have to figure this out when you guys are in New York next week.
Yeah, we can try something. I'm leaving on Christmas Day, and Brunts is going there the 26th. The team is leaving on December 23rd, so they'll be out there starting then. And you have the other little sidebar is some of the recruits who just signed. I don't know that they're going to be like full-fledged going into things during practice, but they're there, and so they get to see what it's like. So you'll see a lot of those guys who are early enrollees there, and so there is kind of an actual interesting dynamic besides just force feeding, like you're supposed to care about this bowl game. Like if you're thinking about 2025, you actually are. There is a lot of stuff going on where it should have your attention.
Yeah. Plus, it's Nebraska playing in a football game, and those opportunities, you only get 12 guaranteed a year. You should enjoy them when they come around. That's how I feel about it. Last thing, I guess. Have you been to New York City before? Will this be your maiden voyage?
I've been there once for one day, so I'm not going to act like I know a lot. I was there with Brunts. It was weird. Rutgers. We were
Rutgers. You guys went into the city for a nice bowl of spaghetti.
Yeah, we did. I can't remember what we ate. It wasn't memorable, but it was okay. So yeah, we'll see how I hold up. I have to hang in there for like 12 hours before Brunts gets there to hold my hand. So we'll see if I can do that.
I think you'll be okay.
You
But
could,
what you'll learn is, I bet brunch is going to take you multiple times to get some, to just get some slices of pizza. He's just going to go all in on just the publicly available pizza everywhere you turn. I can see brunch being very excited about this.
Yeah. And I guess it's an open air press box at Yankee Stadium, which is great for baseball season. Not as great on December 28th, but whatever. I'll wear my long.
You've been to Penn State. You're prepared.
Yeah, I'll pack accordingly. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Sometimes I will hear sports writers or some be curmudgeons about stuff. It's like, you're covering sports. Like, at the end of the day, you just gotta. I mean, that's a pretty nice gig.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think you'll enjoy being in New York at that time. It's just, to me, the disappointing thing is that it just took most of the fans out because it's so expensive to get there, and it's such a poorly timed bowl. Like, I understand why they want to have the game and everything, but it's just a really tough spot, and it, almost cruel in a way that you finally make a bowl game and people are excited about going to something, and Tampa's right there in your grasp, and you're unable to.
It was literally right there in the grasp.
Yeah. Well, also down on the ground where the snap was too, is in that grasp as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's why Kevin Gallick is here, to bring everything full circle.
There you go.
So, all right. Anything you want to throw in? Anything we didn't get to?
No, that was some fine portal discussion. We'll see what the next 24 hours, 48 hours bring. There's always something.
Yeah, I'm excited for us. There didn't seem to be any breaking news in that 37 minutes that we've been on. So I always consider that a win. We did 2 podcasts and only 1 commitment happened during one of them. So we have that going for us here today on Tuesday. All right. So for Brian Christopherson, I'm Mike Schaefer. We're Husker247. Be sure to check out everything we have going on at Husker247. There's plenty of portal content, recruiting content, football content, basketball content, baseball season. The college baseball season is going to get underway here in like 6 weeks. Brunch is going to have all the coverage of that as well. So you want to check out everything we have going on at Husker247. There's a volleyball national championship being played this weekend. We will not be in Louisville because Nebraska made a bowl game this year. So we don't have to cover the volleyball championship because we have other things going on in the month. But we will have coverage of the game. We just won't be in Louisville. So big contest for Nebraska, little ACC Big Ten battle. You think this team gets it done, Brian?
Yeah, I do. I think Penn State, I'm not an expert, but I did cover John Cook's first team when I was at the Daily Nebraskan that won the national title in Richmond, Virginia. So I can tell you a lot about Gracier Sapero and Jenny Kropp, Amber Holmquist. That was a team that won it back then. But yeah, Penn State played its best match against Nebraska in the regular season finale. And I feel like the Huskers will have a little return serve for them. And also Lexi Rodriguez seems like she is like getting
on a mission.
Everything. Yeah. Like, it was unbelievable watching. Their defense as a whole was just incredible on Sunday, but Lexi and some of the plays she made, it's like, how do you even, like, how's that happen? So I think they'll win that one. And then I think you're going to get Nebraska versus Bus Boom.
Yeah.
So we'll see how that goes. That'll be a 5-setter, I bet.
Nebraska's current coach versus Nebraska's future coach, maybe?
You wonder.
So, yeah, that would be quite the game in Louisville. That sets up for quite a nice Sunday. So have that going on as well. We'll have coverage of volleyball. So Husker247, your one-stop shop, everything Nebraska athletics, and plenty of podcast content as well. So we'll see if we have any others coming this week or if we come back to you after Christmas. And if we do, happy holidays. We'll catch you then.